Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Lillian, for that gracious introduction. And good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? I'm told that I don't need this microphone, that I have something in my pocket that will project my voice out. Now that I know there's a free trip to Hawaii involved, I wish I'd come to more of these lectures. I didn't realize there was that much at stake. I really feel privileged to be here. We drove over from Santa Cruz today to get here tonight, and I've heard a lot about this colloquium from some of the other people who've been here, and I really feel privileged to be taking part in it. I wish things like this were going on all over the state. We all need to move to a higher level of consciousness about the way our regions work and the way California works as a kind of mosaic of many sub-regions. And to get involved in these a colloquium like this that explores the way so many features of one region interconnect and overlap and overlay. Extremely important stuff. So I'm really glad to be here with you tonight and talk about the part of it I know something about, which is literature. I want to start with this with a couple of paragraphs from this book that Lillian just mentioned, my book on California, which just came out in a 10th anniversary edition with a new cover and a new foreword, a new prologue by me. And I just want to read a couple of paragraphs from this foreword to kind of get things going. 10 years ago, I went searching for the Golden State and wrote a book called Californians. You might say I started in the middle. Heading out from Santa Cruz, I traveled north and south, hoping to see again, or perhaps for the first time, the complex region I call home. If I were going to write this book today, I would start in a different place. I would start at the beginning, with some comments from the people who have lived the longest in this part of the world. I would start with someone like Frank LaPena. He is stocky and brown-skinned, with a silver beard and silver hair receding from his smooth forehead. He lives in Sacramento now, where he heads the Native American Studies program at the State University campus. He grew up farther north, in a region bounded by the McCloud River, Redding, and Mount Shasta, traditionally the home territory of his people, the Wintu. They have called it home for over 10,000 years. Frank is a man so deeply rooted you can almost think the Western earth speaks through him. He likes to talk about Mount Shasta, which dominates the landscape in Wintu country. For him, this 14,000-foot volcanic peak is much more than a dramatic landmark and photographer's delight, much more than a challenge for climbers and skiers. It is a holy place he approaches with respect. For him, the mountain can be a kind of mentor. If you sit still and listen to it, he says quietly, it can teach you a lot. Layered with generations of family memory, Shasta also serves as a chapel and a sanctuary. He talks about a pilgrimage he once made to a mountain when another uncle passed away. Frank went on foot and left behind a lock of his own hair as he expressed his grief and prayed for safe passage. For the Wintu, who call themselves the Mountain River people, Shasta is your final point of contact with this world and your gateway to the next. When I heard that story, I envied Frank, and I told him so. I told him that after the Loma Prieta earthquake in October of 1989, with its epicenter just 8 miles from our home, I had been filled with fear and runaway anxiety and for a while a sense of betrayal. I longed then for a place I could go and stand and voice my fear and release my anxiety and make some kind of peace with the powers that reside in the earth. As you tell me about your pilgrimage to the mountain, I said, I realize what a yearning I have in my life for that kind of ritual or for that kind of relationship. I wish my culture provided me with more guidance in this area, but it doesn't. I was astounded by his reply. You don't have to deprive yourself of that, he said. It is really up to you. It is always available. You can awaken that aspect of a place if you make your own connection with it. It is really up to you. This was a truly liberating idea, that I could awaken the sacred aspect of a place, or at least open the way to this possibility. What it means is being awakened to that place in myself, and that possibility in myself, and allowing the openness to such a dialogue. Now that, from my point of view, is the key word here tonight, dialogue. This is what's going on when we tell our stories and when we write our poems. There's a dialogue between the storyteller or the poet and the listener or the reader, and there's also a dialogue between lives and places. I think this is one of the really important things that writers do for us, or that we can all do in many ways we do this for one another, to keep ourselves in touch with this ongoing dialogue between places and the people who inhabit them. This is especially true here in the Central Valley, which happens to be one of the richest literary regions in the American West. So what I want to do tonight, in concert with James Johnson and some of his people from the Reader's Theater, and in the spirit of dialogue, is talk about some of the voices that have shaped this valley's literary history. It starts, of course, with the tribes who were native to this region, like the Wintu and the Yokut and the Maidu, who had no written language, but they had a long tradition of chanting and sung poetry and creation stories that were passed along from generation to generation. Just to give you one example, we're going to start with a story called Origin of the Mountains, which was recorded here in the valley in the 1870s. It's a Yokut version of how the parallel ranges came to be the way they are. And like so many tribal stories, it combines a sense for regional geography with a bit of trickster comedy. Are we ready?
Once there was a place where nothing in the world but water. About the place where Tulare Lake is now, there was a pole standing far up out of the water, and on this pole perched a hawk and a crow. First one of them would sit on the pole a while, and then the other would knock him off and sit on it himself. Thus, they sat on the pole above the waters for many ages. At length, they wearied of the lonesomeness, and they created the birds which prey on fish, such as the king's bird, eagle, pelican, and others. Among them was a very small duck, which dived down to the bottom of the water, picked its beak full of mud, came up, died, and lay floating on the water. The hawk and the crow fell to work gathering the earth from the duck's beak, which was brought up, and commenced making the mountains. They began at the place known as Tahab's Path, and the hawk made the east range, while the crow made the west one. Little by little, as they dropped in the earth, these great mountains grew athwart, the faces of the water pushing north. It was a work of many years, but finally they met at Mount Shasta, and their labors were ended. But behold, when they compared their mountains, the crow's was a great deal larger. Then the hawk said to the crow, "How did this happen, you rascal? You have been stealing some of the earth from my bill, and that is why your mountains are the biggest." And it was a fact, and the crow laughed in his claws. Then the hawk went and got some Indian tobacco and chewed it, and it made him exceedingly wise. So he took hold of the mountains and turned them around in a circle, putting his range in place of the crow's. And that is why the Sierra Nevada is larger than the Coast Range.
The earliest writings from this part of the world came from travelers and soldiers and surveyors and various adventurers who began to enter the valley in the late 18th century and explore it on foot and on words on into the late 19th century. The best known during this century of writing were people like Mark Twain and John Muir, the great naturalist, and William Henry Brewer, who worked as a field leader for the first California Geological Survey team and covered a lot of the valley in his classic work, Up and Down California, 1860 to 1864. But the very first written accounts that we have that contain images of valley life come from the Spaniards, the missionaries and the military men, as they made forays inland from the coastal settlements. Juan Crespi was a Franciscan priest who had entered California with the first overland expedition led by Gaspar de Portola in 1769. 3 years later, while he was traveling with Captain Pedro Fages, he was in the first party of Europeans to see the Great Central Valley. Fages had orders to establish a mission near Point Reyes. Searching for a way to get there by land from Monterey, he led his party up the eastern shoreline of San Francisco Bay until they reached Carquinez Straits, which forced them further inland. After resting at what is now Concord, they climbed a spur of Mount Diablo, and this is what they saw, as recorded by Fray Juan Crespi on March 30th, 1772.
Monday, March 30th, 1772. We set out from this valley and entered some medium-sized hills of pure earth and pasture. We ascended a pass to its highest point in order to make observations, and we saw that the land opened into a great plain as level as the palm of the hand, all level as far as the eye could reach. Below the pass we beheld the estuary that we were following, and saw it was formed by two large rivers. Where these united to form the estuary, we saw a good-sized island. We saw also that one of these rivers, the one to the south, was formed by two other rivers, as wide as the principal one, and that the place where they united must be about 8 leagues distant from the pass. We made out that these three arms, or three large rivers, were formed by an even larger river, which descended from some high mountains to the southeast, very far distant. All that part of it which the eye reached descended from the east and then divided into three rivers. These three flowed to the north, making several windings, and afterwards they formed only two, one of which divided into two others. And the three then united to form once more the great river which entered the bay, or round lake, of which I have already spoken. We gave to this great river the name of my father, San Francisco, so that he may intercede with his divine majesty for the conversion of all the immense body of heathen that no doubt must be on the banks of the great stream, which it seems must be the largest that has been discovered in New Spain.
Okay, thank you. Now think of that. These guys had traveled up from Mexico City, all the way up through Mexico, up through Baja California, all the way up the coast of California, past San Francisco Bay. They come in through Carquinez Straits, and he sees the biggest river that has been discovered in New Spain. He was astounded. He also described a great plain as level as the palm of a hand. Now, Lillian, do you think that's a better line than a great skillet that stretches from north to south? I don't know. Crespi named this river for St. Francis, as they often did. They named these places for the days of the saints or for patron saints of the priest or the soldier. They later changed it to the San Joaquin. That was the first view of the San Joaquin. This particular party camped that night near Antioch, and the next day, knowing they could get no further without boats, they started back toward Monterey to report what they had found. And this is pretty characteristic of the Spanish relationship to this valley. They had their hands full trying to develop the communities along the coast. And a few more decades would have to pass before interior settlement began. And then several more decades more would have to pass before travel and descriptive writing began to take a more literary turn. It's interesting to think of the role of San Francisco during the 19th century. San Francisco, by the 1860s, had become the first and only literary town west of the Mississippi River. Los Angeles was still a village in the 1860s. Denver was still a Pony Express stop. Seattle was hardly there. But thanks to the gold rush and the extraordinary anchorage provided by San Francisco Bay, San Francisco had developed both as an economic and cultural headquarters, far in advance of anywhere else in the western United States. So that by the 1860s, Mark Twain was based there as a journalist. And Bret Harte, the short story writer, started a magazine called the Overland Monthly and really launched his career from San Francisco. And Ambrose Bierce, a Southern writer, who wrote a lot about the Civil War and eventually disappeared in Mexico. He was in San Francisco for about 20 years. And there was a poet who was famous in her day called Ina Coolbrith. All these people were in San Francisco in the 1860s. And it became a place, as it continues to be until this day, where writers congregated. It was right around the turn of the century that a writer who was associated with this San Francisco literary circle found his way into the Central Valley, and he found there the material for his major work, which has since become a classic of American fiction. The writer I'm referring to is Frank Norris, and his novel was called The Octopus, which was published in New York by Doubleday in 1901, right after the turn of the century. Frank Norris was not a native of California. He had come west from Chicago with his family at age 14. He studied at Berkeley and for a while at Harvard. Then he returned to New York. He returned to San Francisco as a newspaper man. And then with the success of his early fiction, he went back to New York. Then when he got the idea for The Octopus, he came back to California to research the novel, which is set in and around Tulare in the 1880s. It's based upon a land swindle that was engineered by the Southern Pacific Company. That's the octopus of the title. The protagonists are local wheat ranchers fighting to protect their hard-won holdings. One of the ironies of this novel is that much of Norris's detail comes from the wrong valley. It's based upon impressions that he gathered while visiting some ranchers that he knew down around Hollister and in the San Benito Valley. And what's the worst part of it is that somewhere near Tulare in this novel, there's an old Spanish mission that looks a lot like the one at San Juan Bautista. So certain valley residents have trouble with the authenticity of this locale, but the struggle that he set there was based upon a very real and brutal one, which became the focus of national attention after the notorious Muscle Slough affair of May 10, 1880. Outside the town of Hanford, when a United States Marshal and railroad-backed landholders had a shootout with members of a local settlers' league. It was a very famous shootout in the early history of California, the settlement period of California. The Octopus is not only the first novel to emerge from the Central Valley, it is the first significant novel to emerge from the West Coast. And in it, Norris announces themes that are going to turn up repeatedly in California literature in the years to follow. Themes that have to do with the struggle for control of the land and for shares of its abundant produce. This comes up time and time again in stories and novels to this day. But first articulated right there in 1901. Now there's another writer from this same period who is equally significant in my view. A writer whose most enduring work was also inspired by certain features of this unique sub-region of the American West that we have come to call the Central Valley. I refer to Mary Austin. Like Norris, Mary Austin was also from out of state. She was raised and educated in Illinois. She moved to Kern County with her family in 1888. On the northern slope of the Tehachapi, she began to pursue her chosen career as a writer, focusing first on California lives and California landscape. The first of her 35 books, and in some ways still the best, is Land of Little Rain, which was published in Boston by Houghton Mifflin in 1903. Looking closely at the stark and unforgiving terrain of the lower San Joaquin, she finds touches of loveliness mingling with the buzzards and the relentless heat. She discovers the awesome balancings of life and death, and a kind of wisdom humans can still learn from. The paragraph that we're going to hear now comes from a chapter in Land of Little Rain called Scavengers.
Probably we will never fully credit the independence of wild creatures and their cognizance of the affairs of their own kind. When the 5 coyotes that ranged the Tejon from the Pastoria to the Tunawai planned a relay race to bring down an antelope straight from the van, an eagle swung down from Mount Pinos, buzzards materialized out of invisible ether, and hawks came trooping like small boys to a street fight. evidence in the deep woods that the blue jays are not all about to tell. The hawk follows the badger, the coyote the carrion crow, and from their aerial stations the buzzards watch each other. What would be worth knowing is how much of their neighbors' affairs the new generations learn for themselves, and how much they are taught of their elders. Man is a great blunderer going about in the woods, and there is no other except the bear makes so much noise. Being so well born beforehand, it is a very stupid animal, or a very bold one, that cannot keep safely hid. The cunningest hunter is hunted in turn, and what he leaves of his kill is meat for some other. That is the economy of nature. But with it all, there is not sufficient account taken of the works of man. There is no scavenger that eats tin cans, and no wild thing leaves a life disfigured on the forest floor.
Okay, thank you. This is a marvelous essay about buzzards and vultures and coyotes, and right at the end she says, there is no scavenger that eats tin cans. We got that, this is 1903. We got this environmental voice talking to us. Because this valley was settled somewhat later than the coast, and because it was, and still is, more rural than urban, its emergence as a literary region took that much longer. The first generation of indigenous California writers were born in the San Francisco Bay Area and began to publish around the turn of the century. Writers such as Jack London, who was from Oakland, and Gertrude Atherton were contemporary with Mary Austin and Frank Norris. In the Central Valley, the first indigenous voices began to be heard in the 1930s. In particular, two very strong voices, the poet William Everson and William Saroyan. These two writers not only grew up in the San Joaquin Valley, they found their earliest inspiration here and thus became the first writers to produce a body of work that was unmistakably of this region. William Everson was born in Sacramento in 1912. Until the outbreak of World War II, he farmed near Selma. In 1949, he converted to Catholicism and soon thereafter entered monastic life in the Dominican order. All during the 50s and 60s, he was prominent in the Bay Area poetry scene, known then as Brother Antoninus. He was often grouped with Beat Generation poets like Allen Ginsberg and Gary Snyder and Lawrence Ferlinghetti. In 1969, after 18 years as a monk, he left the order and he moved to Davenport outside Santa Cruz, where he still lives. William Everson turned 80 last fall, and he's still writing. He's published about 50 books. He's had an extraordinary career as a poet and as a master printer, as a scholar and as a student of the works of Robinson Jeffers, and also, in my view, as a charismatic force in contemporary American literary life. More than any other writer that I personally know, Everson has joined the life of language and the life of the spirit, pursuing the connection between language and the sacred, and our relationship to that as writers and as seekers after the truth. It's a commitment that precedes his conversion to Catholicism. It has its roots, I believe, in a reverence for land and landscape and open country that has characterized his work from the very start. And that, in turn, is tied to the world that he grew up in, right here in the San Joaquin Valley. I think you can hear what I'm talking about in this poem, which comes from his second volume, which was published by the Ward Ritchie Press back in 1939. The book was called San Joaquin, and this is the title poem.
This valley, after the storm, can be beautiful beyond the telling, though our city folk scorn it, cursing the heat in summer and dryness in winter, and flee it, Yosemite and the sea. They seek splendor. Who would touch them must stun them. The nerve that is dying needs thunder to rouse it. I, in the vineyard, in green time and dead time, come to it yearly, and take nature neither free nor amazing, but the secret shining, the soft, indeterminate wonder. I watch it morning and noon, the unutterable sundown, and love as the leaf does the bough.
Okay, some of those lines there, the secret shining, the soft, indeterminate wonder. I don't know that anybody had written about the valley in that particular way before 1937, 38, when he wrote this poem. Had anyone brought that degree of reverence to a valley vineyard in print? The one other writer who might have would be William Saroyan, Fresno's most famous native son. Saroyan was born in Fresno in 1908. His first book, The Daring Young Man on the Flying Trapeze, was published in New York by Random House in 1934. And Saroyan was instantly famous. All during the 30s, he was talked about as the most famous writer in the United States. It was an extraordinary, sudden career that began to develop for him. And he kept turning out books for the next 45 years, over 50 titles in all. Stories, plays, novels, memoirs, works that brought him international renown, and works that returned compulsively to his sprawling family of Armenian immigrants and to Fresno and the valley world of his boyhood and early years. Saroyan was, among other things, a great stylist and a storyteller with a true gift for improvisation and digression that would sometimes drive his critics crazy because he would just spin off in some direction that seemed to be way off the subject and come back again. And if publishers wouldn't publish it, he'd say, too bad, I'll write something else, see if you like that. He was really a free spirit. The Daring Young Man on the Flying Trapeze is a daring work for its time, jumping into a literary world that was ruled then by Ernest Hemingway and Sinclair Lewis. Where did I put? I want to read you how that starts. It's an amazing opening, if you haven't looked at that for a while. It has the kind of wild outburst energy that we got 30 years later from Jack Kerouac when he produced On the Road. And this is an equivalent kind of literary surprise. Listen to the way this book starts. 1934. I hadn't had a haircut in 40 days and 40 nights, and I was beginning to look like several violinists out of work. You know the look, genius gone to pot and ready to join the Communist Party. We barbarians from Asia Minor are hairy people. When we need a haircut, we need a haircut. Well, now it's important to remember that Saroyan, in addition to being a great storyteller and an enormously prolific writer, was also an immigrant writer at a time when there were no visible immigrant writers in this country who were being paid attention to. He was an ethnic minority writer when there were no ethnic minority writers. This was 1934. For 150 years, American literature had been written by people, mostly men, of Anglo and Germanic background, from Melville and Hawthorne and Edgar Allan Poe to F. Scott Fitzgerald and Hemingway and William Faulkner and John Steinbeck and Frank Norris and Theodore Dreiser. These are all great writers, by the way. I'm not saying this in a critical way. It just happened to be the fact that it was a very Anglo, Northern European history that that American literature had been characterized by. As of 1934, there were not yet any writers of Hispanic background, no black writers who'd been listened to. There were no writers of Asian background, nor were there yet any Jewish writers. Jewish writers didn't come into the kind of recognized mainstream of American letters until about 10 years later. But here came William Saroyan out of Fresno, not only a fresh voice in the middle of a gloom-filled depression, but the first literary voice from an ethnic minority to receive widespread recognition in the United States. This selection is from his second book, published in 1936, called Inhale and Exhale.
I tried to forget Armenia, but I couldn't do it. My birthplace was California, but I couldn't forget Armenia. So what is one's country? Is it the land of the earth in its specific place? Rivers there, lakes, the sky there, the way the moon comes up there, and the sun. Is one's country the trees, the vineyards, the grass, the birds, the rocks, the hills, the mountains and valleys? Is it the temperature of the place in the spring and summer and winter? Is it the animal rhythm of the living there? The huts, the houses, the streets of the cities, the tables, the chairs, the drinking of tea and talking? Is it the peach ripening in the summer heat on the bough? Is it the dead in the earth there, the unborn of love beginning? Is it the sound of the spoken language in all the places of the country, under the sky, the printed word of the language, the picture painted there, the song of that throat and heart that dance? Is one's country their prayers of thanks for the air, the water, the earth, the fire, and light? Is it their eyes, their lips smiling, their grief? Well, I do not know for sure, but it is all these things as remembrances in the blood. It is all these things within oneself, because I have been there. I have been to Armenia, and I have seen with my own eyes, and I know. The grapes of the Armenian vineyards were not yet ripe, but there were fresh green leaves. And the vines were exactly like the vines of California, and the faces of the Armenians of Armenia were exactly like the faces of the Armenians of California. The rivers Arax and Kurua moved slowly through the fertile earth of Armenia in the same way the rivers Kings and San Joaquin moved through the valley of my birthplace. And the sun was warm and kindly, no less than the sun of California. And it was nowhere and everywhere. It was different and exactly the same. Word for word, pebble for pebble, leaf for leaf, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. It was neither Armenia nor Russia. It was the people alive in that place. And not only people, but all things alive. They're animate, inanimate. The vines, the trees, the rocks, the rivers, the streets, the buildings, the whole place. Urban and rural. Nowhere and everywhere. The earth again.
Nice. Good. The earth again. Saroyan, where do I live? How do you define your homeland? Can you define your homeland? It's a great question. And he was the first, I don't know if any California writer has ever asked that question that passionately before Saroyan did. Nowadays, there's a great dialogue abroad about place and the sense of place and how do we define our place and how do I relate to my place. Here's Saroyan. What are we talking? 60 years ago, he's voicing this kind of passion for two places at once that he finds the touch point in the earth itself. Now, the 1930s is also the era that gave us the grapes of wrath. John Steinbeck was not native to the Central Valley, like Saroyan and Everson, but he was their contemporary, and he was native to another valley not so far away, the Salinas Valley, just over the Coast Range, with a very similar history and a similar kind of economy. Just as the octopus was the magnum opus for Frank Norris, so was the Grapes of Wrath, the masterpiece of this most famous of all the writers who have emerged from California. And it's just interesting that the Valley would give him his most compelling material. In a way, this novel and the film based upon it, the John Ford movie, put the Central Valley on the map of the world, or at least gave it a place for the first time in the world's imagination. Grapes of Wrath is such a monumental work that it's a whole subject in itself. To begin to talk about it is not nearly enough, but I just want to say a couple of things about the book in the larger context of California literature. One of the reasons it continues to be thought of as the ultimate California novel, it may or may not be, but a lot of people still see it that way. If it qualifies as the ultimate California novel, I think it has to do with the way this book dramatizes one of the ongoing themes in this region's fiction. And that is the interplay between the California dream and the failure of that dream, or the underside of the dream. For a number of reasons, it continues to be news when things go wrong in California. Things have been going wrong from day one, but the message never gets out. I don't know why. For a great many people who live here, as well as for many who regard it from afar. The dream of California as a land of promise, as a place of high expectation, as a place you can go to change your luck or to change your life or to explore a new possibility, a land of new opportunities, this has always come first. The place itself and a grasp of the place and how it works and its habits and its hazards tends to come second, tends to come often much later. And this gap, this distance between expectation and reality has given us a profound and ongoing theme. I want to just, as an aside here, say that the California dream has hardly ever been promoted by the serious fiction. Chambers of Commerce do this. Chambers of Commerce promote the California dream. Popular songs promote the California dream. A quick draw journalism and ad campaigns for real estate and railroads and sport cars, they promote the California dream. The first big book on California in the late 19th century was financed by the Southern Pacific Company. It was called California for Health, Pleasure, and Residence. And they hired a very good writer to write it, and it just drew thousands and thousands of people out west because they wanted to sell space on their train and sell their railroad track. What fiction has provided time and time again is a counterpoint, playing under or against the promotional copy, to explore the ironies, and to look around the edges of the dream, where so many Donner passes have always lurked, right up there beside the glittering seams of gold. And no one has done this more potently than Steinbeck as he charts the pilgrimage of the Joad family on their trip west. They become the archetypal immigrant seekers heading for the land of promise. The first half of the novel, if you'll remember, is brimming with hope. It's almost in the exact center of that novel that they get their first glimpse of California. Their expectation builds toward a radiant view of this land of promise exactly as they have imagined it. At Tehachapi Pass, Al Joad pulls off the highway and they all gaze into the lower San Joaquin. And here's the way it's described. Ruthie and Winfield scrambled down from the car, and then they stood, silent and awestruck, embarrassed before the great Central Valley. The distance was thinned with haze, and the land grew softer and softer in the distance. A windmill flashed in the sun, and its turning blades were like a little heliograph, far away. Ruthie and Winfield looked at it, and Ruthie whispered, "It's California." Now, from that point onward, just about everything goes wrong. What appears to be a pastoral wonderland is, in fact, a world of labor battles and short housing, peopled by thousands of roaming and desperate migrant workers, just like themselves. By the end of the novel, the Joads are sleeping in a boxcar. They're watching the floodwaters rise. Today, we would number them among the homeless. They have no money. They have no food. They have no connections. They have few prospects. If anything remains for them, it is the inextinguishable flame of the spirit. Much of this novel's holding power can be found right there in the way Steinbeck honors the tenacity of the human spirit and the will to survive. But the region and its high promise has failed the Joads. The Western earth itself has turned against them as they watch the orchards turn to mud. Now, people who followed the history of the Okie migration, they'll say, well, the grandchildren of the Judds, they all own condos in Fresno now, and they did okay. And that's true. The grandchildren of people who came out during this period, many of them now the families survived. And that's not the way the movie ends. The movie has a much more upbeat ending. But that's the way the novel ends, with the world turning to mud around the Joads. And that's Steinbeck's working of the California dream in a really profound way. Many, many writers have done it, but none more vividly, I think, than in The Grapes of Wrath. Now I want to move forward to the 1960s. We're talking about the 30s. Something happened in the 1960s in regard to the literature from the Central Valley. This was a period when the range of work from the Valley and the range of indigenous voices from this part of the world really began to broaden via the work of writers such as Leonard Gardner and Joan Didion and Luis Valdez and Lawson Inada. Just a brief word about Leonard Gardner. He was born in Stockton in 1933. He's not been a prolific writer, but his best-known work, his novel Fat City, which is set in and around Stockton, is another one of those works that has kept the Central Valley alive somewhere in the national imagination, partly because it became a novel that was directed by John Huston at a time when John Huston had a lot of clout in show business, and this movie is still shown a lot. When it first came out in 1972, the film of Fat City was, for many Americans, their first look at this region since John Ford's version of The Grapes of Wrath. In our media-driven society, that's the way we remember things. But Fat City is a very fine novel if you ever have a chance to look at it, and it's also a very fine movie. One of the most distinctive voices to emerge during the 60s nationally was that of Joan Didion, who was born in Sacramento in 1934. She went to UC Berkeley, and from there she went to New York, where she wrote her first novel called River Run, which is about a landed Sacramento Valley family. She also established herself as a magazine journalist and a shrewd commentator on contemporary American life. And her career since then has gone back and forth between writing fiction and nonfiction, and screenplays. She's written some big screenplays. Panic in Needle Park. I think she did the script for her novel Play It As It Lays. I think she worked on the script of True Confessions, which was a novel by her husband, John Gregory Dunn. Anyway, her collection of essays, Slouching Toward Bethlehem, came out in 1968, which is now a classic work of nonfiction prose by anybody's measure. There's a wonderful essay in there called Notes of a Native Daughter, which first appeared in Holiday magazine in the early 1960s. Like Soroyan writing from San Francisco in the early 30s, Joan Didion is in New York, looking from the big city back toward the homeland.
It is very easy to sit at a bar and say, La Scala and Beverly Hills are earnings in San Francisco, and to share a persuasive delusion that California is only 5 hours from New York by air. The truth is that La Scala and earnings are only 5 hours from New York by air. California is somewhere else. Many people in the East are back east, as they say in California, do not believe this. They have been to Los Angeles or to San Francisco and have driven through a giant redwood and have seen the Pacific glazed by the afternoon sun off the Big Sur. And they naturally tend to believe that they in fact have been to California. They have not been, and probably will never go. It is a much longer and in many ways a more difficult trip they might not want to undertake. One of those trips on which the destination flickers on the horizon, ever receding, ever diminishing. I happen to know about that trip because I come from California. I come from a family that has always been in the Sacramento Valley. That is what I want to tell you about. What is it like to come from a place like Sacramento? If I can make you understand that, I can make you understand California, and perhaps something else besides. For Sacramento is California, and California is a place in which a boom mentality and a sense of Czechoslovakian loss meet on an uneasy suspension, in which the mind is troubled by some very but ineradicable suspicion that things had better work here, because here, beneath that immense bleak sky, is where we run out of the continent.
Okay. Thanks, Troy. Now that's a very famous line, that last line. some buried but ineradicable suspicion that things had better work here because here beneath that immense bleached sky is where we run out of continent. She's talking about California, she's talking about the whole western U.S., she's talking about this profound role of the western coastline as some kind of final limit where whatever you believe in is going to be tested one more time. But her way into that whole view of the West is from Sacramento, from growing up in Sacramento, and from seeing Sacramento as a metaphor for this whole part of the world. And she's such a persuasive writer that she gave it that kind of weight. First writer to do that I know of, and to define it that specifically. Now, Luis Valdez is another writer from this period, or another writer who emerged in this period. He was born in Delano in 1940. His grandfather was a Yaqui who fought in the Mexican Revolution. Luis Valdez's parents were migrant workers who had come north from Arizona by way of the Imperial Valley into the lower San Joaquin. Luis studied drama at San Jose State. The year he graduated in 1964, his first full-length play was produced there, called The Shrunken Head of Pancho Villa. And the story is that William Saroyan had been invited to the opening night, and he actually showed up, which took everybody by surprise. And at the end of the play, he took the chewing gum out of his mouth and he threw it into his program, and he jumped up onto the stage, stealing the show, and proclaimed, "This is a brilliant play. It is the work of a genius." A year later, this is obviously a great encouragement to Luis, who was looking for a way to get started as a dramatist, and his moment came because just the next year, the farm workers' strike began down in the lower San Joaquin, led by Cesar Chavez. And Luis, by the middle of 1965, was over there, and he had founded his now famous guerrilla theater group, the Teatro Campesino, as a dramatic voice of the farm workers' strike. He had studied enough drama that he understood commedia dell'arte, and he understood improvisational theater. And with just a few props and masks and volunteer actors, he began to perform from the back of a flatbed truck out in the fields, doing bilingual productions that were inspirational, politically informative, and at the same time, a really daring new form of theatrical expression. All of these things going on at once. Out of this came a series of actos, one-act plays, that are bilingual, and it combines satire and social commentary with Aztec and Mayan imagery and mythology as reconstituted in these isolated agricultural valley towns where Luis would go and perform these dramas. And out of this evolved the larger dramas that have been staged since Valdez moved his teatro over to San Juan Bautista. Plays such as El Fin del Mundo, and Bandido, and Corridos, and Zoot Suit that have toured the United States and toured Europe and made Luis internationally famous. With the film versions of Zoot Suit in the early 80s and then La Bamba, Valdez is now numbered among the leading American playwrights. In fact, Jim Johnson told me he's going to be here when? Next?
Phil Esparza from
Yeah.
El Teatro is going to be here on Sunday, April 4th, doing a documentary presentation on the evolution of El Teatro for our Arts and Lecture Series.
Yeah, great opportunity. Because Luis Valdez has had an extraordinary career that's still in motion, and it started in Delano in 1965 on the back of a flatbed truck. Now, there's one other writer I want to mention from the 60s whose work began to appear back in that era, and that's the poet Lawson Inada, who was born in Fresno in 1938. He was one of the first Valley poets to have the good fortune to study with Philip Levine at Fresno State after Phil Levine moved out here in the late 50s. And during the last 35 years, Levine has had an enormous influence on the shape and the growth of this region's poetry. There are just dozens of of poets who owe a debt of gratitude for the support they received there. Philip Levine's legacy is a whole other subject unto itself. But Lawson Inada went from Fresno to the Iowa Writers' Workshop, which is still thought to be the most prestigious writing workshop in the United States. And his poems began to appear in the mid-1960s. They were gathered into a book, I think I have it here, called Before the War, published by William Morrow Company in 1971. Now, in the history of America's ethnic voices, this is another landmark book. The war referred to, of course, is World War II. Lawson was among the first poets, I think the first poet, American poet of Japanese background, to write about the internment experience. And this is the first book by an American poet of Asian background to be published in New York. 1971, it's not that long ago. Lawson's most recent book, called Legends from Camp, this just came out about 2 months ago, explores a lot of the same themes that gave shape to Before the War. The internment, the World War II internment, his fascination with jazz and with jazz musicians, and also the early years in his hometown of Fresno, such as he voices in this poem we're going to hear from Legends from Camp called Finding the Center.
Charles and I had played there all along. It was dirt, good dirt. It made good gardens. Tomatoes, squash, peppers, corn. It made good mud. It made good mounds around the orange trees, the cactus, for rivers and roads and boats and cars, living life in the valley and mountains. That was about it for now. Mama Gomez is calling us in for supper. But tonight, if we were good or lucky, she would feed us sweet tortillas and the crunchiest iced tea as we sat on the porch, watching moths meet the moon, fluttering stars, and whatever else is going on P Street. Yes, it was a good life, on good dirt. Dirt to be smoothed over for marbles manana. And as we worked the earth for our bright little spheres, we looked for all the world like farmers, 2 kids, neighbors, and industrious flocks. This is why it didn't surprise us when the dirt was finally discovered. And oh, the attention it got. It was even, as they say, in the papers. Politicians and surveyors going local, placing plaques in the Gomez's yard. And what the plaque said, we already knew. It was obvious. If they had asked me, or Charles, or the Gomez family, we could have saved them a lot of money. You're standing on it. This dirt is the exact geographical center of the state of California.
Lawson in that poem is doing something like Joan Didion does in Notes of a Native Daughter. For her, Sacramento is the kind of metaphoric center for the West, and here, wherever he was playing when he was a kid, turns out to be the geographical center of the state of California. Also, I love this poem for what it says about a sense of place. You look at the poem by Everson, San Joaquin, his opening line, "This valley after the storms can be beautiful beyond the telling." And you get that kind of broad screen vista, panorama of beauty. This is a different sense of place. This is a kid's sense of place. This is a kid's love of dirt for the feel of the dirt. We don't really know where we are till the end. We're just in the dirt with these kids. But he has this wonderful memory of soil at that kid level. And then that turns out to be the geographical center of the state. But check out this book if you can find it. There's some beautiful stuff. This poem, Finding the Center, is a new Fresno poem. I don't know when he wrote it. Published in 1992, but he could have written it 25 years ago. Lawton's kind of quirky about getting his stuff published on time. Now, from the early 1970s onward, we have seen what you might call the full flowering of literature from this valley. With the increasingly broad range of voices that have emerged between Tejon Pass and Mount Shasta. There are many more voices now to be talked about than we can possibly dwell on in the time that we have tonight. Jerry Haslam, who's already been here, is a writer whose work, as I understand, inspired this whole colloquium. Gary Soto, another poet and storyteller from Fresno, has won just about every award that an American writer can win. He's only around 40 years old. I don't know how these things happen. Alan Chong Lau is a very fine poet, grew up near Chico. Robert Vasquez from Fresno. Richard Rodriguez, who's now on the New York Times bestseller list. He grew up in Sacramento. He was the first Mexican-American writer to ever appear on the cover of the New York Times Book Review. Hunger of Memory. Sacramento's his hometown. Art Coelho, Robert Vasquez, George Keithley up at Chico, Joyce Carol Thomas. There's just a long list of writers. Joyce Carol Thomas came from Tracy. There's a guy, Richard Doki, is a very fine short story writer, lives over in Lodi. So there's a lot of writers, and there are going to be more. But to suggest the range and the variety, I want us to hear tonight from 4 or 5 more of these contemporary voices. Many of you I know are familiar with the work of Wilma Elizabeth McDaniel, who has been called, I think Eddie Lopez from the Fresno Bee called her the biscuits and gravy poet. She came west from Oklahoma, much as the Joads did back in 1936. She was a teenage daughter of a migrant family. She spent most of her life since then in the San Joaquin Valley in and around Tulare. And through her poetry, she has brought into recent times the spirit and the flavor and the texture of this particular history. She's a self-made poet whose work, for me, has the poignant and down-home clarity of a country western song. For me, that's a high compliment, because I listen to a lot of country music, and I think we can find a lot of our truest wisdom in the lyrics of the best of the country western tunes. I have to qualify that, yeah. And I know a little bit about how Wilma works because she sends me things from time to time that are written out on pieces. This all came in one envelope. 3 pieces of paper with 3 different poems and 3 different sizes of paper. This was just ripped off a paper bag. And that's the way she works. But she's just this wonderful, kind of authentic voice who's absolutely her own person as a writer. The poem that we're going to hear is from one of her recent books called The Girl from Button Willow. The title is Overheard in Wyatt's Cafeteria, Bakersfield, California, August '86.
Sunday has come down with 107 degrees outside at 3 o'clock. I couldn't cook today if someone beat me with a Peachtree switch. So we are here in a dazzling cafeteria after a long walk through a maze. Worse is now, dishes clink and ice cubes in our frosty glasses. Conversation drifts across from a nearby table. Fascinating. I listen intently. Stop chewing so it's not to miss a word. An older man tells a man of 30-ish. 72 Nobel Prize winners urge the Supreme Court to reject creationism. A big Okie in the next booth hears the statement too. His ruddy face flushes redder, and he asks his woman companion, "Berta, what in the hell business is it of the Supreme Court? What does people think about creation? It's already being created."
See, she could save us all a lot of trouble just clarifying issues like that. It's already been created. Now, Luis Omar Salinas is another writer often included among the Fresno poets. He was born in Texas in 1937, but he moved out to California with his family when he was 8, and he's lived in the Central Valley since then. He is also among those who studied with Phil Levine. Salinas published his first book, Crazy Gypsy, while he was still attending Fresno State, and he has been a strong voice in the Chicano community ever since. He's written 6 books. He's won numerous awards. He lives right now down in Sanger. The poem we're going to hear comes from his chapbook, Follower of Dusk. The poem is called My 50 Years Celebrate Spring. It pays tribute to his own time in the valley, the look of the land, and the people who have worked it.
My 50-plus years celebrate spring. On the road, the mountains in the distance are dressed in a wild blue silence. On the sides of the highway, the great orchards unfurl, deep and green again, like a pregnant woman gathering strength for the time to come. And with the passing of each season, human life knows little change. 40 years in this valley. The wind, the sun building its altars of salt, the rain that holds nothing back. And with the crop at its peak, packing horses burn into morning. There are many diligent Mexican workers stacking up trays and hard hours that equal their living. I've heard it said that hard work ennobles the spirit. If that's the case, the road to heaven must be crowded beyond belief.
Nice, good. 40 years in this valley. Shirley Ann Williams is another poet from Fresno. In her case, she was born there. She grew up there. She went to Fresno State. And she's also among the many who credit Philip Levine with the early encouragement that made her a writer. After her first book, The Peacock Poems, appeared in 1975, Shirley Ann Williams was recognized as a strong new African-American voice. That book was nominated for a National Book Award in 1975. It was followed by a second book of poetry, and then in 1986, the novel Dessa Rose. For a number of years, she's been a professor of literature at UC San Diego. The lines we're going to hear come from her second book, Someone Sweet Angel Child, published in New York by William Morrow Company in 1982. These are the first 2 stanzas from a very long poem called The Iconography of Childhood.
Town less than 10 stories tall, spring rains wash the wind, lighten hell's distance, snowflake sierras bloom at land's end. Land flat as a hoe cake, summer's hot enough to fry one. Crops stand out in the fields, far as eyes can see. Every time you work a row, another appears on the horizon. These are tales told in the darkness, in the quiet at the end of the day's heat, surprised in the shadow rooms of houses, drowsing in the evening sun. It is in this one there is music and free women. Some child is messing with the big trumpet. Before Miss Irma can speak, Ray Charles does of the nighttime, and it is fading. Music is seldom given airplay in those valley towns, heard mostly in juke joints, we've been told about, and so longed for in those first years in the valley, and it seemed almost illicit to us. But the women pay us no mind. We settle in the wonder of the music in their softly lit faces, listening at the songs of our grown.
I just want to say one word about the last phrase in that poem. We settle in the wonder of the music and their softly lit faces, listening at the songs of our grown. When it's written on the page, grown is spelled G-R-O-W-N. When you hear it, you don't know how it's spelled. It can be grown or grown. It can be grown in the sense of the grown-ups, the elders, the parents, or groan in the sense of the sound of our burden, the sound of our inner cry. When you read it, you get G-R-O-W-N, but when you hear it, you get both of those meanings living together in the word. It's really a beautiful line. Now we're going to leave Fresno and move up to Stockton, which is the hometown of Maxine Hong Kingston. Maxine was born there in 1943. Her parents were immigrants from China. Her father ran a laundry in Stockton. Maxine eventually graduated from UC Berkeley And like Soroyan, somehow emerging out of Fresno, with the publication of her first book, Woman Warrior, in 1976, Maxine Hong Kingston was suddenly famous, not only in the United States, but very soon around the world, as a result of this visionary book, which is about ethnicity and about womanhood and about empowerment, someone finding her power. It happens that Maxine Hong Kingston was the first writer of Asian ancestry to appear on the front page of the New York Times Book Review after Woman Warrior came out in 1976. Subtitled A Memoir of Girlhood Among Ghosts, this book floats between fiction and nonfiction. It's a compelling mix of personal memory and family history and myth and magic. It's the story of a young woman coming of age in a valley town, much influenced by the tales and superstitions of her Chinese mother.
Night after night, my mother would talk stories until we fell asleep. I couldn't tell where the stories left off and the dreams began. Her voice, the voice of the heroine, was in my sleep. And on Sundays, from noon to midnight, we went to the movies at the Confucius Church. We saw swords of women jump over houses from a standstill. They didn't even need a running start. At last, I saw that I, too, had been in the presence of great power, my mother talking stories. After I grew up, I heard the chant of Fa Mulan, the girl who took her father's place in battle. Instantly, I remembered that as a child I had followed my mother about the house, the two of us, singing about how Fa Mulan fought gloriously and returned alive from war to settle in the village. I had forgotten this chant that was once mine, given me by my mother, who may not have known its power to remind. She said that I would grow up a wife and a slave, but she taught me the song of the warrior woman, Fa Mulan. I would have to grow up a warrior woman.
What's happening there? An old chant crosses the ocean from a village somewhere outside Canton in South China, where the mother first heard it, to empower the daughter writer who was growing up in Stockton, in the delta lands of the San Joaquin. It's quite a tale. A lot of people don't make that connection with Maxine. She's such a monumental writer in a lot of people's minds now. They don't connect her to that point of origin. But that's a big part of the story in itself. Now there's one final selection that I want to get into the room tonight. The final voice we're going to hear is that of Darrell Babe Wilson, who is a member of the Ajuma and Atsuge tribes, commonly called the Pitt River Nation. Darrell is a writer and a community activist for Native American rights. I first met him when he was doing graduate work in literature at UC Davis. I believe he's now at the University of Arizona at Tucson. He grew up in Northern California. And as you'll see in this short excerpt from the opening of his story, Diamond Island, Alcatraz, it's a kind of writing that brings our literary journey full circle, combining family history and regional geography, and the kind of legend that we started out with tonight. So here is a little bit of Diamond Island, Alcatraz.
Grandfather lived at Aswan, 100 miles of East Redding, California, in a little shack out of the flatland. His house was old and crooked like a fairy tale. His belongings were few, and they too were old and worn. I always wanted to know his age, and often asked some of the older of our people if they could recall when grandfather was born. After silences that sometimes seemed more than a year. They always shook their silvery gray heads and answered, I don't know. I was old and wrinkled, he was old and wrinkled with white hair for as long as I can remember, since I was just a child. He must have been born between 1850 and 1870. Thanksgiving weekend, 1989. It was this time of year when I began to think about grandfather and his ordeal. I keep promising myself that I will write this story down because it is time to give the island of Alcatraz a proper identity and a real history. It is easy for modern people to think that the history of Alcatraz began when a foreign ship sailed into the bay, and a stranger named Don Juan Manuel de Ayala observed the rock and recorded Alcatraz in his logbook in 1775. That episode, that sailing, that recording was only moments ago. Grandfather said that long ago the Sacramento Valley was a huge freshwater lake, that it was as long as the land, from the northern part of California to the southern. And that great shaking of the angry spirit within the earth caused a part of the coastal range to crumble into the outer ocean. When the huge lake finally drained and the waves from the earthquake finally settled, there was the San Francisco Bay. And there, in isolation, containing untruth, was Diamond Island, Alcatraz.
Now that's a wonderful story. If you want to read the rest of it, it's in a recent collection called Talking Leaves, Contemporary Native American Short Stories. It came out last year. But it's wonderful the way that Darrell in that story lays claim to a huge chunk of California terrain through the memory of his grandfather and the memory of his people, and a memory that far predates the European arrival. Stories that keep him in touch with the whole valley, and a valley picture that includes the San Francisco Bay and includes this little dot of an island and goes all the way up to Mount Shasta. It's really an important perspective we're getting from writers like that. Okay, I want to try and say a couple of things here in conclusion. We've heard a dozen voices. There's a couple dozen more at least that deserve to be heard in a context like this if we had the time. How does this contribute to the theme of this colloquium, defining the Great Central Valley for the next century? What's the role of poetry? What's the role of storytelling, past, present, and future? Everybody has a role to play. The ranchers work the land and they grow the crops. The water managers move the water around. The carpenters and the builders build the houses, and the road crews keep the roads open. Meanwhile, writers are the record keepers. Writers are the ones who bear witness to the times that we are all living through and have lived through. I always keep in mind a line from James Baldwin, who wrote some wonderful essays about being a writer. He said, writers are the ones who take the time to write down what other people can't or choose or won't write down and record. He's not saying that writers are smarter than other people or wiser, but writers are the ones who decide to write it down, to keep a record of where they live and how it looks, of what it's like to be in this place in this time, of what's outside the window. What does the world look like? What does the world feel like in the time that I'm living in it? That's really all you can do as a writer. And if you do it well, writers do something for all of us, because we all can't take the time to do that, or won't. But writers are the record keepers and the ones who bear witness. They help us to see the places that we inhabit and also keep us in touch with the ongoing dialogue between a place and the lives that are being lived. And part of the way they do this is to bear witness to the outer reality and also the inner reality, and the way those two play back and forth. There's a dialogue that's going on between our interior and our exterior. And that's one of the things that we get from serious writing. In these places that we inhabit, we shape our places, and our places shape us. And the writers we've been hearing tonight are among those who keep us in touch with this very profound and intimate process. There's also a dialogue going on between the past and the present. How can we possibly understand the present if we don't stay in touch with the past? It seems simple to say that, but at the rate of change that we all know here in California, the past slips away very quickly. But a lot of good writing keeps us in touch with that process. There's also the dialogue between the old homeland and the new, such as we get in works by Saroyan and in Woman Warrior by Maxine Hong Kingston. And how does this shape a way of seeing, a way of thinking about your place, a way of thinking about yourself? I think one of the most important roles for writers now and in the years to come will be in this realm of cross-cultural understanding. We have all now pretty much agreed that we live in a multicultural society. It's taken a long time to get to the point where we agree on that. America's been a multicultural society from the beginning, but it's only about in the last 10 or 15 years that we have agreed that it is a multicultural society. So that's a big step. But multicultural diversity is not the same as cultural understanding. That's the next step. Once we recognize that we are living in a culturally diverse society, and it is that way, and it's going to become more that way, how do we move to higher levels of cross-cultural understanding? Certain writers are very good. Some of the writers that we've heard from tonight are very good at moving back and forth across the cultural borders and opening windows from one culture to another, or from one subculture to another, or from one part of the world to another. And in doing so, they open windows of perception that help us all to see one another more clearly. To the extent that I can see the other, I can see the stranger with clearer eyes, I know that much more about myself. And that's where good writers can take us time and time again. I think here in the Central Valley, you're very lucky because there has accumulated a very rich body of literature. There's an amazing literary tradition here that I think a lot of people aren't fully aware of. I know that most of the people that I talk to about California literature, they don't see California as having a body of literature. Somehow literature is in Chicago, or literature is in New York, or literature is in Paris or Rome, or someplace back there. There is a very rich body of literature here in the Central Valley, and that is going to get richer as the years go by. And it has finally begun to reflect and reveal the cultural diversity that's characterized this valley for a long time. I think 30 or 40 years ago, you couldn't say that there was a culturally diverse literature in the valley, but there is now that reflects the diversity, and that part of it is going to get richer. And so there's a tremendous resource that's available as you look at the future and think about the relationship between the past and the present and the future. These works of poetry and storytelling are there to be used. So that's about all I have to say on this subject. I thank you for the opportunity to come over here and talk about it, and I certainly will be available for questions, comments. Is that going to continue? So we'll stop right here. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'd like to have you come and introduce your readers from the Reader Theater.
Yes, excellent.
We'd like to acknowledge these people, too, who have really provided the voices.
Catherine Dennis Lee, Dennis Nichols. Catherine Dennis Lee, come on up here. Catherine Dennis Lee, Dennis Nichols, Chad Hammond, Kimmy Barnes, Jim Nunes, and Troy Gregory. Thank you.
It's customary to have cards passed out, and people who have questions will
have some, and read them, or if you would like to come up here, then do so. And, we have our card around our county now. Every Thursday night we flip a coin. Who distributes cards and who recycles? Okay. How do writers ensure their words will last 1,000 years, 100,000 years, 1,000,000 years? Words are always lost in languages, words are always lost in languages.
That's true. All of that is true. Words do get lost. There's hardly any permanency in this activity. And I think if you expect to be immortalized in print, you better forget it. The fact that paper wears out, libraries catch on fire, books disintegrate. That's not what it's about. The activity, again, it's a form of dialogue. I'm a writer. I'm alive in the 1990s. I try to do my best to pay attention to what's going on around me. I write what I can write. I try to find readers. If somebody reads it, then that opens up a kind of dialogue, and something comes back to me from that. And we're all involved. It's part of releasing the creative imagination that we're all born with. And so much of life is just exchanging the creative imagination that we have in the various forms that it takes. And being a writer is just one of those forms. And the statement that you make, it lasts for a while, and it's like, the electronic spots that disappear back into the computer when you lose your program. This is the new excuse in writing classes now. Nobody says, I missed class because I had a flat tire. Nobody has flat tires anymore. The question, I can't get my paper in because my computer ate it. Well, where did it go? Where did it go? Just these electronic spots went back into the electronic field. And it's still out there somewhere. And so, the classic works of American literature have been around for 100 years or 150 years, and everybody hopes to be one of those writers, and everybody hopes to write a book that will last and endure. Plato and Aristotle, they've been around for 2,500 years. But that's not very long, Has anything lasted 10,000 years? What lasts 10,000 years are the oral stories. You talk to Australian Aborigines, they've been telling stories to one another for 10,000 years, and the people who know them now know the stories that their ancestors knew 10,000 years ago. I don't know the stories my ancestors knew 10,000 years ago. I wish I did, but we haven't kept that oral tradition alive that way. Maybe that's the real source of immortality. It's getting back to the oral tradition and being consistent about that. If immortality or longevity is a goal, but you kind of, I don't know, it's one of those things, you want it, you hope for it, but you have to let go of it as a goal or you drive yourself crazy because there's so many ways that written works disappear.
What or who began your literary interest and at what age?
What began my literary interest? Who or what and at what age? Wow. I'll tell you, I'll be honest with you. I think it started with the Bible. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, what do I mean by that? I grew up in a New Testament fundamentalist and church family. The kind of New Testament fundamentalism where everything's been stripped away from the worship service. You go into a Catholic church, there's statues, there's stained glass, there's candles, there's incense, there's organs. There's 50 things to tantalize your senses and keep you interested at the sensory level. Even if you're bored by the liturgy, the statuary and the stained glass has a pleasure all its own. But in the congregation that I grew up in, none of that had been mentioned in the New Testament. So it didn't make its way into the house of worship. There was no statuary, there was no stained glass, there was no candles, there was no funny hats on the minister. There was no outfits. There was no gold. There was no silver. There was no organ. There was no saxophone. There was no piano. No instrumental music because it's not mentioned in the New Testament. God wanted us to have a piano in the worship service. He would have mentioned it in the... If you can point out to me the place in the Bible where God said we ought to have a piano to sing with, or a saxophone, or a guitar, or any of it, I'll be the first one to bring one in here. But till then, we're just going to sing. Amen. So, as a result, I grew up in a religious context where your only means of making contact with the higher power or expressing your feeling toward the higher power took the form of words. That's all that remained. We read from the Bible, and we said prayers, and we heard a preacher, and we sang with our voices. And those were your means of trying to make a relationship with the higher power. And I very early rejected the church congregation because I wasn't getting enough from that at the spiritual level. But what stuck with me was the idea that words might be a path to salvation. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And I don't mean to say that I have achieved that through writing I'm on some kind of exalted spiritual path. But that's my take on it. You know, that's one of the things that keeps me into writing as a calling. That I have the idea that it is a calling and that there is a spiritual dimension to it. That it is, in the Zen sense, a form of work, a kind of spiritual task.
How many tries or how long did it take you to get your first book published?
Well, my first book, I co-authored with an anthropologist from the University of Hawaii who had done a master's thesis on the subject of surfing in the Hawaiian Islands. Which, if you study Hawaiian history, it's a bit like doing an anthropological thesis on baseball in American culture, which is a big subject. It was a big activity in traditional Hawaiian culture, so it was a kind of interesting book. But he had written it as a academic treatise, so it was unreadable. And I got into the act and I rewrote it. And I don't know if it. We sent it to 26 publishers. The short answer is 26 publishers, and finally the 27th person, who was the 9th person we had sent it to, who had said, if no one is interested in this 3 or 4 years from now, I might take another look. That's how long it took. So anyway, that was my introduction to the publishing scene and how thick-skinned you have to be to come to terms with rejection, because it goes on and on and on and on. So I went through 26 rejection letters from 26 publishers, and we finally got the book published.
I thought Mary Austin's book, Land of Little Rain, referred to the Owens Valley for Independence, California.
Well, a lot of it is about the Owens Valley, but a lot of it is about the lower San Joaquin. Yeah.
Is writing and poetry growing because of education, or is it driven by another force?
Is writing poetry? What's that again?
Is writing and poetry growing because of education, or is it driven by another force?
Is writing and poetry growing because of education, or is it driven by another force? Well, I'll tell you. I think, you know, writing, telling stories, poetry is a form of singing, and writing short stories is a form of conveying information between human beings that it must be fundamental to the way our minds are designed, because These forms didn't just drop out of nowhere and people started doing them. They are features of the human intellect that emerged a long, long time ago. And then they gradually started to take the form of writing. But I think people tell stories to one another because they have to. You know, they started telling stories a long, long time ago, and that still goes on. There's always been an oral tradition. One of the things that's changed in the last 40 years is the emergence of creative writing programs and creative writing classes. There are now just hundreds of programs in the United States where you can major in creative writing and you can go on and get an MFA in creative writing. And even campuses that don't offer degrees offer courses in creative writing and writing poetry. Well, before World War II, this wasn't going on. 50 years ago, there were no creative writing programs in the United States. They didn't exist. It's a post-World War II phenomenon. And whether that's good or bad is something else, but what it does, it proliferates the number of writers that you hear about and you come across. And I teach creative writing at the University of California at Santa Cruz once a year, and I come across a lot of good writers. There's a lot of well-trained people that come out of these writing programs who are writing good poems and writing good stories. So that just multiplies the number of people who are practicing these skills and these crafts and arts. But I think underneath that there's the drive of the creative imagination that is always going to try to find a way to express itself.
Tell us about the spirit of your place, your geography, and your place in California literature. Aren't you one of the first Native American writers from California to be widely published and recognized?
Native American?
Maybe Native Californian.
Native Californian.
Are you Native American?
Well, I may be 1/16th Cherokee, but I don't want to advertise that because my grandfather ran off on my grandmother before we could check this out. But he claimed he was part Cherokee, but I don't know. But as a California writer to get widely published, well, actually, you know, there's a lot of California writers have had big careers. I mean, Jack London was a California writer. He's the most widely read, probably the most widely read writer on earth, English language writer. There have been writers coming out of California for a long time. I don't know how to respond to that. I don't see myself as that. I've had a lot of books published, but I don't know how widely read they are. In fact, in some ways, it's a disadvantage to write about California. I think, you know, the publishing business is still controlled principally out of New York, and New York publishers. California is still very remote for them. It seems like a long way away, and it still seems like a strange place. And if you have a book by a New York writer that's about Manhattan, it's looked upon as a national book. And they'll publish it in New York, and they'll promote it as a book of national significance. It can be about the architecture in the lower end of Manhattan, but it's a national book. But you can have a book by a California writer about California, and it's looked upon as a regional book. They'll think of it as a regional book, and they'll think twice about publishing it. Now, let me give you a number. I don't know. Do we want to get into this? I came across this the other day. I got some figures on the reason New York publishers think this way. I got some figures on the total amount of money spent on books in 1987 in the United States. Total amount of money spent on books. It was something like $12 billion. Almost half of that, 60% of it, was spent in New York, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. 60% of the money spent on books was spent in those 4 states. something like 15% of that money was spent in California. Even though California has the 11% of the national population, we also spent about 11% of the money on books. So people back in New York, when they see a book coming out of California, they say, well, are the people in Connecticut and Pennsylvania and New York really going to care about this? Because that's where we sell our books. And it has a big effect on how somebody's perceived. So being a writer from California is a kind of strange fate in a publishing world that's still very much dominated by New York publicity and distribution and New York money accounting, stuff like that. What was the first part of that question?
First part was tell us about your spirit and your place, your geography, and your place in California literature.
Well, my place, I think of the Coast Range as my natural habitat. I know a guy lives down in Bakersfield. He was born in Taft, and his big move was into Bakersfield. And he's been living there his whole life, and he loves it. He says, I don't like to go over into the Coast Range where you live. And I said, why not? He said, well, you know, late in the day, you get down in those, like the San Lorenzo River Valley, and the sun drops behind a hill. You can't see the sun anymore. I get nervous in there. And he said, my son lives over there, but I hate to go visit him. I just get nervous. And his terrain has kind of shaped his outlook. He loves to see the sun come up and go all the way over and go all the way down. And that makes him feel comfortable. That's his place on Earth, and he feels located there. And I feel that way about the Coast Range. I was born in San Francisco, and early in life, my dad was born in Oklahoma and grew up in East Texas. And he grew up in the gun culture. And he loved to go hunting deer, and every summer, a couple times a year, we'd go up into the mountains north of Marin County with my dad and his buddies, and we'd go camping and go hunting after deer. And I never really took to the hunting, but it really introduced me to the Coast Range early in life as a place to get close to, as a place with a certain kind of cycle and a certain kind of fauna and flora. And there's a kind of continuity of terrain that runs from, like Ukiah down to San Luis Obispo, where you have the same kinds of trees, same kinds of oaks, same kinds of tawny, dry, rolling hills in the summertime. And I feel really at home there. And that's where it took me a long time to see that. When I did this book on California, Searching for the Golden State, I'd spent my whole life in California, but I realized that I didn't know it that well, and I wanted to get in touch with the whole range of the state, and I also felt like there was a way to sort of lay claim to the whole state as a Californian, that California was my home region, and I just needed to know it better, and then I would really have a grasp of where I came from. But everywhere I went, I found that everybody lived in a part of the state that they thought of as the true California. In those days, I thought the true California was west of Highway 1, that it was a strip that ran along the coast. And then I come up to San Francisco, and I meet people who spend almost all their time in San Francisco, and they think San Francisco is the true California, because that's the oldest cultural headquarters. Then you go down to L.A., and they think L.A. is the true California, because it's the biggest and it controls the economy. And then you go over to Fresno, and the people in Fresno think Fresno is a true California because it's the agricultural center not only for Fresno, but for the valley, but for the whole United States. And then you get up in the northern counties, and they think Humboldt is the true California because that's where we got the real cash crop that runs the rest of it. And so I saw all these sub-regions. Really, California is what I find, and I met a woman who lives up in Sierra County. What's the name of that little valley up above? I guess it's Sierra Valley, up above Truckee. And she'd been living there and around Reno for her whole life. She said, I don't like to go down to Sacramento. I don't like to go to San Francisco. I said, why not? She says, I just don't like it down there at sea level. She said, I've never felt comfortable at sea level. I've spent most of my life over 6,000 feet. There used to be a bumper sticker in Truckee that said, never trust anybody under 5,000 feet. But it really opened up my sense of this, because she said, and I said, well, how do you feel about California? You were born here, you spent most of your life here. She says, I can't deal with California. There's too much of it. I said, well, how do you think of yourself? She says, I come from the Sierra Nevada range. I'm from the Sierra Nevada range. That's where I grew up. That's where I spend my time. That's where I live. That's what I can relate to this place. I can't deal with sea level. Don't tell me about Sacramento. I don't want to go there. That's the state capital. I don't care. I live in the Sierra Nevada. Well, that really cleared my head. I saw, okay, that's the way I really feel about it. I can't deal with all of California. There's too much of it. I love the Central Valley. I love to come over here. As I said, my father came out here from Texas in the 1930s, and very much like the Jode family. It's just a mere chance that I was born in San Francisco instead of Bakersfield or Oildale like Jerry Haslam, because our fathers were very much alike and came out here for very much the same reasons at the same time. But the Central Valley is not my realm. The Coast Range is my realm. That's my place, and that's where I'm located. And I've written a lot about that. I've got a series of novels that are about the central metaphor is the San Andreas Fault and the presence of the fault line that cuts through this terrain. And it's about a family that has a ranch that borders the San Andreas Fault. And it has a physical presence in their lives. It's a psychological presence. It's kind of symbolic presence. I've thought a lot about that, because it took me years to realize I'd spent my whole life within about 4 miles of the San Andreas Fault. And I crisscrossed it all the time. I go back and forth the fault line once a day. You know, did that for years and years and years before I realized it was there. And it started to pay attention to my own regional geology. So that's the short answer to your question. The long answer is in my books.
I'd like to thank you again for sharing with us, and we have a reception that the students are providing in the faculty dining room. We will help you join Mr. Houston and his wife and their books and us for cookies and hot chocolate.
Great. Okay. Thanks. Thank you.